Thank you very much. Listen, thank you very, very much for having me tonight. It is true, I have been, Kathy and I have been big fans, big supporters, admirers of the work that's done at the lab school, of the board, of the administration, the teachers, and of course, most importantly, the kids. And it's really an honor to be asked to say a few words tonight. I will depart from my speech for a moment. We are celebrating the Wright brothers tonight and their ingenuity and their innovative spirit. I will note, as the United States Senator from Connecticut, that we actually claim the first flight in Bridgeport, Connecticut, not in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It is a distinction. It is a distinction that Connecticut claims and no historian recognizes. But we just want to point it out for everybody, for the record. So I have a short time to say a few words to you tonight, and I really want to frame my thoughts to you with a quick story about a young man from Connecticut. It's a 16-year-old African-American high school sophomore. He went to an urban high school in Connecticut. I'll call him James for the purposes of tonight. And he had this habit at the beginning of his sophomore year of walking out of his class in the middle of a lesson and just wandering the halls. And he did this often during his sophomore year, and each time things would sort of play out the same way for James. After walking around the halls for a while, he'd eventually run into an administrator or a school security officer that would get him to the school office, and his grandmother, who was his primary caregiver, would get a call telling her that James needed to be picked up and taken home. The school would then suspend him for a few days, and he'd return back to school, and then within a few more days, he'd be back out doing the same thing, and he'd be back home with his grandmother. This cycle played out so routinely at the beginning of his sophomore year that by the end of October, he had been suspended for more than half of the days in the school year. Now, James never gave anybody trouble when he walked the halls, but one day when an assistant principal approached him, James was just so frustrated at how he had been being treated that he started to argue. Now, he was a big kid for his age, but he was a total teddy bear. He never, ever hurt anyone. And that day, all he did was talk back, which is something that we all did a lot of back when we were his age. But the next thing he knew, he was getting arrested. He was getting charged with disorderly conduct. And to compound his troubles, because he was 16 years old, Connecticut's law at the time treated him as an adult, meaning that he had to go to adult court, meaning that this was on his permanent record. And why did all of this happen to this kid? It's because James had a learning difference. He had an IEP, but he didn't have the right services. He was 16 years old, and he struggled to read at an elementary level. And he was expected to keep up in high school. And so he didn't stay in class because it was so frustrating. And in his view, it served no purpose anyway. He wasn't getting anything out of it. And every day he sat in these classrooms, he was confronted with this toxic mixture of frustration and embarrassment. He had a learning difference that had been basically ignored throughout his schooling. And because of it, this kid had a criminal record. Now, I only know that story because my wife, Kathy, was then a legal aid lawyer in Connecticut, and she represented James to stop this cycle and get him the support that he needed. And now she works with her colleagues at Education Council to try to make systemic changes. Yeah, we can applaud for a good legal aid lawyer. So she works now on these systemic changes. And I tell you this story because it really underscores our collective challenge tonight. The model that the lab school has built, right, it doesn't just work. I mean, it transforms. It allows kids to shine. You're the gold standard. And tonight, it's amazing. You're raising money to make sure that more kids in and around Washington get access to that gold standard, get access to that absolutely life-changing opportunity that comes with the lab school. That's awesome. But our strategy, it's got to be two-pronged, and this is all I really wanted to say to you tonight. First, let's get more kids into top-notch programs like the lab school. That's goal one. Get more kids access. But then let's make sure that the models of instruction that you've perfected, the standards of your students that you've demanded, let's make sure that they spread far and wide all across this country. So last year, Congress quietly repealed the No Child Left Behind law, and now we've replaced it with something called the Every Student Succeeds Act. And the biggest fight in this bill was over an amendment that I offered. The amendment, a version of which was eventually adopted into the final bill, it simply requires school districts to set goals for the performance of what we call subgroups of students, including students with learning differences. Then we want them to track the performance of those students, and if they don't hit their goals, we want them to implement some strategies to get better. All the details are figured out locally, but the expectation of success for every single student with a learning difference was and is now set in law. Now, this section of the bill is really controversial, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple years, but if the lab school model is ever to become a reality for students who have been left out or behind by traditional teaching models in schools across this country, then your high expectations need to remain in the federal education law. And just as importantly, these states that have these broad discretion to set their goals and their improvement strategies, they need to be pushed to think big, to create different, more effective learning environments like the ones that you know work, to expect big things from students and from schools when it comes to educating kids with learning differences. And nearly 60 years ago, the federal government first dipped its toes into local education, Brown v. Board of Education. Why? Because we wanted to guarantee equal rights for populations of kids who are getting a raw deal just because of who they were. And nothing has really changed, because there's no reason for the federal government to be involved in education if it's not for civil rights purposes, to insist that every child have a chance to learn, no matter their race, no matter their income, or no matter the way that they learn. Every kid deserves that opportunity. Education policy is civil rights policy, and civil rights policy is education policy. And so the lab school, here's all I want to say. The lab school, it shows us not just that every kid can learn, but it shows us that every kid has greatness inside of them, right? And our job collectively, if we're really honest with each other, is to recognize that there are millions of kids who have greatness inside of them all across this country, who are being locked into underperformance, who are being locked into futures that they should not deserve, simply because we have not found a way to spread what you've learned, what you've perfected, to the rest of the country. And so I know this is a big mission tonight, but if we're honest, our job is to hold up this school as a shining light of educational success and demand that every child with learning differences in this country, no matter where they go to school, no matter what neighborhood they live in, has the same shot at greatness as the kids who walk through of the doors of the lab school each and every day. I work on this in the United States Senate as a member of the Education Committee, not just because my wife grew up representing these kids, but because I have met the parents here, because I've met the kids here, because I know how their lives have been transformed. And I want to support your work in every way possible going forward and spread it to as many kids as possible across the country. Thank you for having Kathy and I here tonight. Have a great, great evening. Thank you very much.